Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 51. Tony Blair. Spin. Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. And in this week's episode, we're looking at the Prime Minister from the early 2000s, Tony Blair. He was in office from 1997 to 2007. And before we get started, just a reminder, please give this episode a like before you move on. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. So let's get going with Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 51, Tony Blair. Spin. In the episode on Anthony Eden, we stated that some Prime Ministers' terms in office can be summarised by a four-letter word. In the case of Eden, it was Suez, and in the case of Blair, we said it was Iraq. However, when our random number generator finally came to the number 51 for Tony Blair, long after the Eden episode was recorded, events had moved on, and a different four-letter word came to mind to summarise Blair's premiership, which, although it might seem more innocuous, in fact has its own very negative implications. That word, spin. It was a popular term when Blair was Prime Minister, but doesn't seem to be used quite so often now. We were trying to come up with grander titles for Blair's episode, such as Hope and Disillusionment, or perhaps The Rise and Fall of Hope, perhaps even Things Could Only Have Got Better. However, that word spin stuck, short and sweet, and somehow it fits because it can contain a sense of that rise and fall. Iraq, that initial four-letter word, really only highlights the negative aspects of Blair's premiership, but spin somehow summarises his style of politics over his whole time in office. The spinning began successfully enough in a phrase such as the People's Princess, used by Tony Blair to describe Diana, Princess of Wales, after her death on the 31st of August 1997. A phrase which even Blair himself would later describe as corny, has nevertheless stuck. It worked at that moment. Another famous phrase by Tony Blair has been the subject of satire, but in itself shows this ability to spin was turning in on itself. On the 7th of April 1998, when Blair was commenting on the negotiations that were taking place that would lead to the Good Friday Agreement with Ireland, he stated, "A day like today is not a day for sound bites. We can leave those at home. But I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder with respect to this. I really do." Blair rejected sound bites in the first half of a sentence that would end with one of his most famous sound bites. Somehow, in one sentence, he showed both how aware he was of the important role of spin and how such spin could, well, spin beyond his control. What was Tony Blair like? Tony Blair was and is a charming politician. Perfect for a television age, he always seemed ready to stand in front of a camera when he was Prime Minister. He is very good at thinking on his feet, at debating and coming across well, with a quick ability to seem like he was trying his best, given the circumstances, just like you would do. With this masterful way of responding well, often without saying much of substance, he was a consummate politician. Considering he was Prime Minister for over a decade, it's strangely difficult to summarise what he was like. Margaret Thatcher is the only other Prime Minister in well over a century to have more than a decade as Prime Minister. Yet whereas Margaret Thatcher is totemic, an impressionist and a satirist's dream, Blair was never so easy to imitate or to parody. That's not to suggest, however, that he did not have a personality. One biography said that in the latter years of his premiership he became almost messianic, especially during the years of the Iraq War, when there was a sense, after a point, that no one, certainly not hundreds of thousands of protesters, would dissuade him from the version of the truth that he'd chosen to believe, with regards to the threat of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. It was at that point, not unlike Thatcher actually, that he lost touch with that early instinctive ability to reflect and represent the views of average, and I know that's a complicated word, UK voters. Thatcher was said to have become increasingly, absurdly regal towards the end of her premiership, and Tony Blair seemed to become not dissimilarly decoupled from reality, showing the effects of leadership on two very different leaders after a lengthy stint in the top job. One detail not discussed with regard to many prime ministers was the significance of religion to Tony Blair, which repeatedly comes up in his biographies. Tony Blair married his wife, Cherie Booth, in 1980 and had a total of 4 children, including the first Prime Minister's child to be born during a premiership itself since John Russell in 1849. What was the historical background? The key event that divided Blair's premiership in two happened on the 11th of September 2001. In the period 1997 to 2001, Britpop was all the rage in the UK, when a particular retro version of British 60s pop culture became popular with a series of new bands. The millennium passed by with the dire threat that came with the millennium bug, which, it was said, could potentially wipe out IT systems across the globe. Although that didn't happen, it was a noteworthy foreshadowing of the increasing dominance of computers over the years to follow Blair's premiership. Then, on September the 11th, the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York brought an era to an end. Blair had already proven himself ready to use the UK's military to help solve international disputes. In Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and Iraq before the Second Iraq War itself, Blair had ordered military operations by the UK and, at the risk of vast oversimplification, they had seemed to have positive consequences. By the time of September the 11th, therefore, Blair had come to see military operations as a viable way to resolve international disputes. He strongly backed George W. Bush and the United States in its post-9/11 plans, a position which one biographer noted both strengthened and limited Blair's room for manoeuvre. Blair had allied himself with the most powerful country in the world, but his unconditional and perhaps unrequited support for the US arguably reduced his ability to influence US decision-making. Blair's twists and turns as he and his ministers insisted that Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction justified a war, and the way in which he would not back down from his position despite the weakness of the evidence for those weapons, this was the apotheosis of spin, when it at least felt for some that Blair had reached his conclusion before worrying too much about the evidence to support his conclusion. This was exemplified, for example, in what would come to be known as the dodgy dossier. The spin seemed to have become more important than the reality. The US at the time. During Blair's time in office, the UK and the US, at least in military terms, grew closer. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were the two presidents during Blair's time in office. Blair made clear attempts to make sure he was on their side, to the point where some thought he was a little too close. The word poodle was involved. Who could vote? After 1928, when women finally got the vote on equal terms with men, there were few changes in the voting system. Having said that, Blair was responsible for some of the most significant changes since that date, in that it was during his term in office that the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish parliaments or assemblies were set up, moving the UK's constituent territories towards a federal setup for the first time. In this way, members of every other territory than England had a more direct say in certain aspects of their governance. It was one of Blair's most significant achievements, as was his attempt to tackle the issue of hereditary peers in the House of Lords, the upper chamber of UK government. Although he'd initially planned to remove the right of all hereditary peers to vote in the House of Lords, ultimately Blair had to make do with an agreement to reduce the number of such hereditary peers to 92. It was a step in a more democratic direction. What was Tony Blair's background? Blair is, by birth, Scottish, while his father and mother were Scottish and Irish. If Blair isn't strikingly Scottish nowadays, however, is because his family moved around in his early youth, including a stint in Australia, before his family settled in Durham, Northern England, when Blair was 5 years old. He was sent to boarding school in Edinburgh when he was 13, and was one of the 31 Prime Ministers to go on to study at Oxford University. His days at university are famous for being the time when he played in a band called Ugly Rumours. After university, he went into law, meeting his wife, barrister Sherry Booth, during this time when he worked in law. In the mid-70s, Blair joined the Labour Party, becoming the MP for Sedgefield in the northeast of England in July 1983. He was soon identified as a rising star. Neil Kinnock was leader of the Labour Party during most of the 1980s, and when he resigned after the surprise Conservative victory in the 1992 election, he was replaced by John Smith. Under the new leader, Blair took on the role of Shadow Home Secretary. However, John Smith died suddenly on the 12th of May 1994, and during the contest that followed, Blair emerged as the new party leader. How did Tony Blair become Prime Minister? After Kinnock's departure as Labour leader, John Smith began to move the party in a different direction. Blair, however, took those changes one step further, rebranding the party New Labour and, most specifically, removing the famous Clause 4 from the party's constitution. This was a clause which committed the party to nationalisation. It was a significant step away from the version of the Labour Party dominated by the unions that had been swept away from power due to the ascent of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Blair, therefore, made significant changes to the party, but Blair's victory in 1997 was also down to the collapse of the Conservatives. Many had been caught off guard by John Major's electoral victory in 1992. With a majority of 21, Major had not won a landslide. However, after 13 years in power, the Conservatives' dramatic change of leader, from Thatcher to Major, was enough of a fresh start to make the public back the Conservatives once again. By 1997, however, it was clear that the Conservative Party's time in power, scandal-ridden and rife with internal conflicts as it was over. Blair had taken great pains to turn the Labour Party from an opposition party to a potential party of government. In 1997, he gained a landslide 179-seat majority, becoming the youngest Prime Minister for over 150 years. What were Blair's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? One biography looked at for this episode stated that Blair was the third most significant Prime Minister since the end of World War II, after Margaret Thatcher and Clement Attlee. These Prime Ministers, one from the Conservative Party and one from the Labour Party, both transformed the country. It's interesting how Blair, despite his initial overwhelming victory and his incredibly long time in the job of Prime Minister, nevertheless is, at best, only counted at number 3, and isn't seen as era-defining or as transformational as those other two Prime Ministers. His list of achievements is nevertheless long, but it did not go hand in hand with what we could call epochal change. As well as his introduction of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish parliaments and assemblies, he also played a not insignificant part in the Northern Irish peace process. We have also mentioned his actions in places such as Kosovo, but he also introduced civil partnerships, one step towards marriage equality for gay couples. And he ended the ban on gays in the military. He stopped the UK from adopting the euro as its currency. He was the Prime Minister to introduce student fees for university education, and he introduced a national minimum wage. Funding in social services, on early education, and on the NHS was significantly increased during Blair's premiership, leading to hospital waiting lists that were so short that nowadays they seem like the subject of a bizarre fantasy. Why did Tony Blair stop being Prime Minister? Nevertheless, despite all these changes, Blair's premiership is linked with Iraq and Blair's implacable support for the war that removed its leader. The Iraq invasion, began in March 2003, and although the initial aim, to oust Saddam Hussein, can be said to have been achieved when he was captured in December of the same year, the fighting continued for many years, even after Blair's departure from office as Prime Minister. Blair's reputation in the aftermath of the war was tarnished with accusations that he'd misled Parliament and the voters. Blair did go on to win the election that followed in May 2005, but there was a sense that his magic election-winning touch had gone, particularly when his majority was reduced from 165 to 66 seats. This despite a Conservative Party that was still struggling to find a path that would lead it to victory. On the 7th of September 2006, Blair announced that he would leave the role in the next year. Gordon Brown had been waiting in the wings, long expecting to succeed him and increasingly running out of patience. He would take over the role of Prime Minister on the 24th of June 2007. Why should we remember Tony Blair? Blair's insistence on going to war, despite arguments that were unconvincing for many, and against a backdrop of public protest, meant that as well as the war, something else began during that era. In this case, Blair's charm and persuasiveness didn't work. Many were not convinced by the reasons to go to war, but the government ploughed ahead anyway, revealing an ugly truth of politics. Sometimes politicians push through policies whether the public likes them or not. Here was a concrete, ugly, important example which left many people feeling disenfranchised. They hadn't voted Labour for this. Labour was supposed to be the good guys, the progressives, yet they had ignored many people and gone to war anyway. Such a feeling of disenfranchisement is perhaps always there for some. Cynics will always be cynics, but with the rise of social media, the possibilities for exploiting that feeling that those in power don't actually care what you think would only grow in the years after Blair's premiership. It's a style of politics that arguably began here, although of course some would argue it's always been like that. It's gone hand in hand with the rise of the internet and has only gathered strength since. So, Blair's premiership began positively, but ended on that very negative note. Although Blair's ability with spin has been stressed in this episode, somehow that ability vanished altogether when he left office. He hasn't been able to spin his legacy, and Blair's reputation is still up for grabs, still dominated by Iraq, despite his many progressive and positive achievements. In this way, Blair suffers from the fate of another Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, who was also never quite forgiven by the Labour Party for the compromises that he made along the way. See the episode on Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, for more details. Time will tell. But whereas, when we wrote the episode on Eden, we thought that Blair could easily be summed up with Iraq, now it seems that his time in power introduced an even darker edge to politics, one where the message, the spin, has become more important than reality, even uncoupling itself from reality altogether. But it's all just fake news. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. I know more than ever that there are many controversial details in this episode, and it's a difficult one for me personally because I was very much there during that moment of optimism in 1997. For those who wanted to believe that Labour was what the country needed and that things really could only get better, it was a bit like watching the team you love and support reaching the top of the league, only to realise that it wasn't going to get any higher, and in fact that it was only going to slowly descend from that peak. More than ever with this episode, we're aware of what we have left out. Afghanistan hasn't even been mentioned, or the terrible 7/7 attacks in London. We've alluded to the controversy of the Iraq War without going into any detail about its aftermath. One achievement we haven't mentioned is the fact that Blair saw off 3 Conservative Party leaders during his time as Prime Minister, 4 if you count John Major. His longevity in office, thanks largely actually to Margaret Thatcher and even John Major's 7 years as Prime Minister, was taken for granted at the time, but looking back, we can see just how extraordinary that achievement was. And what an extraordinarily stable period of politics the years 1979 to 2007 were, at least in terms of the leadership of the country. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 51, Tony Blair. Spin. Goodbye.